I recently watched a short social media video in which a person who's well known as a narcissism expert was telling a pseudo spiritual podcaster that narcissistic trauma leaves a permanent negative impact in someone's life. Now, I have to say this again: do not trust the experts. When someone tells you that something cannot be healed, that something is going to leave a negative impact forever in your life or negatively forever impact your DNA or your choices or your brain, and they say, this is just how it is, this is just how the world works, what they're actually saying is, this is just how it is for them. And this is how the world works for them. You get to choose whether or not you listen to those people, or whether you choose a different reality and outcome for yourself. And that's what I did. Not only when it came to my physical healing, many of you know that when I was 18 years old, I was fully bedridden with an autoimmune disease that the quote experts called incurable. And that was the first time in my life where I decided it might be possible to heal what others considered impossible to heal. And I did. I fully healed with nutrition and holistic approaches. So that was a really pivotal moment in my life where I realized if somebody's telling me something is impossible to heal, that's their reality and it doesn't have to be my reality. So when it came to the narcissistic and psychopathic abuse that I experienced in my life, both being raised by a narcissistic father and then my first relationship at 21 with a true psychopath, my healthcare practitioner, who had 30 years of grooming and abusing his young clients and students, and I was one of his victims. I decided that I was going to come out of that kind of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, not only healed, but shining. I decided that I was going to heal better than I broke. And now I'm confident in saying that is the case. In this episode, I'll be sharing some of the most important steps I took to fully heal from narcissistic or psychopathic abuse. So if that's something that you have experienced in your life, or you're waking up to that, maybe in your family, community, or government, you are starting to recognize some of these manipulation tactics that are at play in a way that personally impacts you. In this episode, we're going to be discussing how you can fully free and heal yourself from those dynamics and use the painful experiences you've been through as a catalyst for creating a truly beautiful life for yourself. I'm Lauren Geertsen, and welcome to the Truth Activist Podcast. This is where we dive into hidden history, secret agendas, and global awakening. And though we discuss some heavy topics, the focus always remains on empowerment and healing. Because with enough truth, we can heal everything. To set the foundation of where I've come from and where I am now in terms of healing from narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, some of you know the story. When I was 21, I was groomed and abused for 3 years by my psychopathic healthcare practitioner. And I uncovered a major sexual abuse cover-up at my nutrition school, which was the Nutritional Therapy Association. That's where this practitioner taught. And the cover-up I discovered led all the way to the founder of the school. So when I learned all this and broke through the very severe sexual, financial, psychological mind control that I had been under by my practitioner, I decided to put my life on the line to whistleblow his actions, his history, and the cover-up I had discovered that led all the way to the founder. After I went through this experience, I heard from individuals, from quote experts online or online people in the, I'll put quotes around this, self-help realm, that kind of trauma can scar a person for life, and that there is abuse that a person can never fully heal from, that it will always have some kind of negative fingerprint in their life or their DNA. And by grace, my soul knew that was a lie. Like I've already said, I had an experience of healing what authority figures told me was impossible to heal early in my life. That was physical healing. And I went back to that experience and I thought, well, if impossible physical healing is actually possible, maybe impossible psychological, emotional, and spiritual healing is actually possible for me. So I decided to heal better and brighter than I broke. What I want to discuss first, before I get into how I did this, was what does that full and complete healing look like when we come out of narcissistic or psychopathic abuse? Now, that may be in a romantic relationship, with a parent, with a colleague, or a boss, with a spiritual leader, or as many people have been realizing the last 6 years, with leaders in government, with individuals who are manipulating things behind the scenes when it comes to the news and public policy. There's actually an argument to be made that we have all been victims to narcissistic and psychopathic abuse through government agencies and authority figures or billionaires who are wielding power and money to leverage certain outcomes in our world. So we have a tall order of healing to do, and I see this as healing for every individual, even if they haven't had a personal relationship with a narcissist or a psychopath. So here's how I define full and complete healing from narcissistic or psychopathic abuse. First, it's understanding that on a spiritual level, there are no victims. So to put it another way, this is moving beyond victim mentality. Now, when it comes to spiritual truth, it's usually a paradox, which means two things can be true. On one level of consciousness, on a limited level of seeing, on a limited level of wisdom, one thing can be true. And then we gain a greater perspective. We gain more wisdom and we reach a truth that is also true. And here's what I mean by that. So when we're looking, for example, at what I went through, where you have a 60-year-old healthcare practitioner who is sexually grooming and preying on his very young clients and students, there is absolutely an abuser and victim dynamic that must be recognized for the legal system, for healing, for well-being of the community and society. There is an abuser and a victim in that dynamic. When we go to a greater level of wisdom, though, which is something that I experienced in my journey, there are no victims on a spiritual level. This is something that I go in depth in my book, The Scorpion and the Lion, where I illuminate these specific experiences I went through and the spiritual awakenings that I had that showed me how this is actually true. And just as an example, one of those experiences that really widened my consciousness to this perspective. Midway through this, what I called at the time a relationship, but it was an abusive exploitationship with this practitioner. I was in that situation for about 3 years, and I'd say maybe around year 2, I had a moment of realizing that this man was hurting me and he didn't seem to care that he was hurting me. And I let the pain of that understanding just wash over me completely. I remember I was in the living room. This realization dawned on me. I actually leaned up against my living room wall and just melted into this puddle on the floor. My knees felt weak and I just let the pain, excruciating pain, wash over me because I thought this was a relationship. This was my soulmate. This is such a great love. And then I had an out of body experience when this emotional pain reached such a fever pitch in my being where I felt my consciousness rise up out of my body, go very, very high up into this soul realm. And I met this man's soul. I don't know how I knew it was his soul. I just knew it. It was not a lot of visuals, but this clarity in the moment. And this question rose up out of my being, which was, why are you making this so hard for us? His soul replied with a tinge of grief, Lauren, this is for your books. And then I descended back into my body and I didn't know what to make of that. But of course, later I would understand exactly what that meant, because through this experience with him and uncovering the abuse scheme at my nutrition school and living through those dynamics and whistleblowing that, and then recognizing, oh my gosh, what has happened in my community is actually happening all over the world on every level of society. And the same techniques I used to wake up and get out of this abuse and help start to heal my community, that is actually needed everywhere. And I wrote a book about that. That's The Scorpion and the Lion. And it's actually just one of the many books I've written that touches on this dynamic. I learned so much from that relationship, from that situation, that I've applied to my writing, because it's information that humanity needs for a great awakening. Now, this is what I mean when I say on a spiritual level, there are no victims. If this is what, on a soul level, I wanted to illuminate on earth, these dynamics, how we wake up, how we get out, how we heal, how could I have done that without personal experience and without living through the grit of it? So, full healing means reaching a level of consciousness where we understand this, where we've lived a completion of the most painful experiences we've been through, we can recognize as setting us on our path for our highest purpose and our highest experience of love, both receiving love and giving love. Another sign of full and complete healing from abuse is no resentment. Now, this narcissistic quote expert has said in other videos, other interviews, that when it comes to narcissistic abuse, the victim will probably always live with a sense of resentment, and that's okay. Well, that's true on some level, which is that's the reality for many people, but that's not what healing looks like, and that doesn't have to be your reality. And I didn't want that to be my reality, because I understand the impacts that carrying certain emotions long term have on one's health. And one of the goals in my life is to be as vital and healthy as I can be. And I know that carrying emotions like resentment are going to impact how I move through the world and how I feel. So for me, it was important to get to a place where that resentment was fully released. And for me, that did involve the wisdom to see my situation from a higher perspective, to get to that, at least start to entertain the possibility that, what if on a spiritual level there are no victims? What if on a spiritual level we are presented with the opportunities that we can use for our growth? I knew I had got to a place beyond resentment when I had authentic gratitude for this predator's soul. Please hear me. I'm not saying I like him in any way, I have any positive feelings. That would be ridiculous. I mean, I would have to brainwash myself to get there. So it is quite possible to have a very strong dislike for a person, to understand that the choices they've made are truly evil, and to be able to say at a deep spiritual level within your being, thank you for giving me the circumstances to become who I truly am. without these circumstances that you participated in, how would I have ever come to know the strength, the courage, the honor that was my potential? I am someone who wants to leave this earth thinking it was my honor to love this much, to be this courageous, to shine a light in this way, to speak truth to power. And if that's the deepest longing of my soul and how I want to leave this earth, well, how could I do that without circumstances that call me to honor? So that's another indication of what it looks like to fully heal from narcissistic abuse. And a third sign of full and complete healing from abuse looks like recognizing the abusive pattern much faster, being able to more quickly identify manipulation tactics that have been used on you, and to actually start to get an energetic read on whether a person is a narcissist or a psychopath based on their energy, based on their facial expressions, how they move through the world, how they approach you, so that you can become someone who can identify that in a blink of an eye, whether you're looking at somebody on a video, whether they come up to you on the street. But this takes practice, and that's been a very humbling thing to recognize in my own journey. So that's why I'm stating this as the full and complete healing means that you get better and better and faster at recognizing these dynamics. You get less invested in the relationship each time. You bounce back faster each time. The emotions that you experience are more even keel each time. And eventually you get to the point of not having a foot in any kind of narcissistic or psychopathic dynamic with another individual. But like I said, this was a humbling experience. I had to go through quite a few rounds of this, I'll say. For example, I got out of this psychopathic situation, and it took me, 5 years after that to realize that my own father was what I would call a hardcore covert narcissist. That was humbling for me to be like, oh my gosh, I'm 30 years old and I haven't even recognized this. And then the man that I dated, even after recognizing and going no contact with my father, started to manifest or exhibit the narcissistic dynamics. Let me say that a different way. They were always there, but it took me longer than I would have wished at the time to see those manipulation tactics operating within him. They were less pronounced. They certainly were, but they were still there. And so I had, downgraded the severity of the manipulative dynamics which I was involved with, but I hadn't fully purged the fear and trauma from my being that would be a match for that in another person. So, I've gone through these major iterations of recognizing the abuse dynamics, and the closer it is to home, the harder it is to recognize. But I can say that as time goes on, I'm getting better and better. And the less invested I am with a person, the more clearly and quickly I can see those dynamics. So, like, at the time when I realized, I was 30 and I realized, oh my gosh, my dad's a narcissist. How did I not realize this for my whole life? At that time, I had already had a handful of experiences of quickly identifying other narcissists in workplace environments, or, just people my friends were dating or whatnot. I share this example because it's not always a linear process, and I have never seen this where a person comes out of being deeply invested in a narcissistic relationship, like a narcissistic marriage, or they were raised by a narcissistic parent, and it's one and done for them, where they get it out of that and then they don't repeat the pattern at all in a significant way in their life. Maybe there are those people out there, and I absolutely applaud you. That was not the case for me, and it has not been the case for anyone I've met or I've worked with. So I say this to provide so that you can provide yourself with a lot of grace and compassion at understanding this is part of the healing process. It's not instantaneous recognition of every narcissist on the planet once you break the bonds one time. It is more likely to look like you gain practice, you get less invested every time, you bounce back faster, and you heighten your discernment every time. And I do believe eventually that leads to a place of being able to not get invested with narcissists or psychopaths at all. And a big piece there is because every time you go through this process, at least this was the case for me, it was giving me an opportunity to see and heal the fear and trauma that was still operating within me. Because, of course, and I've said this in my previous episode of this podcast, manipulation is fear working on fear. It's another person's trauma operating on our trauma. A manipulator can only get their hooks into you. They can only attach their puppet strings to you, to the fear, trauma, and insecurity within your being. Or I could say also limited level of consciousness or disconnection from God. All of those provide places where the manipulator can tie on a puppet string to you. But the more you heal, the more you become impervious to those strings being tied onto you. A big mistake that people make is thinking that they were manipulated because they were so loving, because they were so caring and generous. And I once believed this, and it is not true. It's a big, fat lie. We can only be manipulated to the degree that fear and trauma operate within us. Now, if you need to wrap your head around that one, take some time and then listen to my previous episode, which is how to become manipulation proof. Those are a few qualities, a few of many, that indicate full and complete healing from narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. And now I want to share 5 steps that I took to get to this kind of healing. The first step was I disavowed self-pity. I did not allow myself to entertain thoughts that went along the lines of, woe is me, this bad thing is happening to me and it's not fair. There really is a temptation to sink into self-pity, and it's very different than self-compassion. It's very different than empathy. Pity is psychic poison, in my perspective, whereas empathy and compassion are heart-based emotions. Pity is a judgment on one's circumstances that usually stems from the perception that we are a good person experiencing bad things and it's not fair. Usually, if we dig into pity, that's where it's coming from. Pity is not an emotion. Self-pity is not an emotion. It's a thought that then creates emotions like frustration or agony or despair. But self-pity itself is a thought. It's a mental story. And I find it very detrimental, in fact, very self-sabotaging to allow this mental story. Like I mentioned, the perception of self-pity usually comes from the framework of, I'm a good person, I'm experiencing a bad thing, and that's not fair. A more wise and mature way to look at that is that there are no good people, there are no bad things that happen to people, and fair is what's happening. Fair is reality as it works. So there are things that happen to people. Circumstances happen to people. And we interpret those circumstances based on the level of our consciousness. And this is why you get some people who will say that the greatest challenge they ever encountered was their greatest gift. They don't see the challenge as a bad thing in their life. Maybe they did at the time, but as they progressed in their wisdom and their psychological development, they came to realize, oh, that thing that happened to me wasn't actually a bad thing. This framework of trying to see life through the lens of fair, I just didn't allow myself to think that way. The way I came to recognize my situation was like, if somebody has a psyche that's susceptible to manipulation and that person lives in a world with narcissists and psychopaths, it is indeed fair that that individual will be manipulated by narcissists and psychopaths. It's fair that I was manipulated because that was the reality I experienced. You could apply this to physical suffering as well. Is it fair that so many people have health problems? Well, the reality is we live in human bodies that are susceptible to chemicals or to processed food or to being disconnected from nature. And we live in a world where there are chemicals and there's disconnection from nature. And so it is fair that sickness is a result because that's the reality that's happening. Now, it might seem like, why would you think that? That's such a negative way to look at the world, but it's actually empowering because it allows you to face reality, right? This perception of what's happening to me isn't fair, it shouldn't be this way, this shouldn't happen. Well, you live in la la land because that stuff is happening and it did happen to you, right? So with that way of thinking of it's not fair and it shouldn't happen, or it shouldn't have happened to you, I should put that in past tense, you are locking yourself in an imaginary world and therefore disempowering yourself to take action over what's actually happening. Self-pity is a way of thinking that shackles your brain so that you are unequipped to respond to actual reality. And to empower yourself to healing means to face reality as it's happening and respond to what has happened and what is happening. That's real empowerment, and that's where healing can come from. But it starts with a complete refusal to entertain any thought of self-pity. The second step that I took for healing from narcissistic abuse was to redefine the word privilege. Now, I'm going to read you a short excerpt from my book, The Scorpion and the Lion, to describe this. I've heard privilege defined as access to, quote, good things, such as convenience and reputations and ease. To some people, a privileged life means the ability to exist so comfortably that one never faces the cataclysmic discomfort often required to seek truth. I staunchly disagree with this definition. Privilege is being presented with the depths of darkness, facing evil greater than your comprehension. Privilege is being presented with the tempting platters of victimhood and self-pity, those psychic poisons, so that you may develop the strength to choose healing over self-sabotage. Privilege leaves you with no other option than to cast everything you once thought you needed, whether social connections, deeply held beliefs, reputation, status, or other forms of your ego's identity, into the fire of truth. In so doing, you incinerate all the illusions that held you back from love. You are left only with what cannot be burned. Your pure and powerful soul, roaring like a lion. In that way, you become resplendent. That's the privilege of a lifetime. Again, that is an excerpt from my whistleblower expose / spiritual memoir, The Scorpion and the Lion. And this is not a, just a quick fix, feel good step here of healing. This is not like your lightweight self-care prescription of go take a bubble bath and spend 10 minutes laying on the grass and do your meditation and listen to your binaural beats, music, healing frequencies, whatever. Like, do all that too, but recognize that is more of like the sprinkles on top of the cake. It's not the cake itself. It's not the deepest substance of healing. What I'm talking about now is the deepest substance of healing. And these reframes that I'm offering to you, this new way of looking at your life circumstances, not easy. Definitely not easy. Tall spiritual orders here, but that's what it takes to fully and completely heal from narcissistic abuse. On a similar note, the third step I took in my healing was shifting from a perspective of blame to that of responsibility. So let me define these two words. Responsibility, I perceive, is the ability to respond. The ability to respond to our circumstances in empowering ways, right? We cannot heal in the same environment that made us sick. We cannot heal with the same emotions and thoughts operating within us that were operating when we were in the connection with the narcissist or the psychopath. So we need to change that internal environment to heal. Now, the highest level of responsibility is understanding that nobody else needs to change for you to be okay. A higher level of responsibility there, let me expand that, is understanding that nobody else needs to change for you to live a fabulous, beautiful life. Okay. My mantra that I started using was nobody can ruin my life but me, and nobody can heal my life but me. Now, I don't see that as self-sufficiency, but rather that was calling me to depend more on divine support and connect to God than I ever had before. Because ultimately, it is our connection to love that allows us to heal anything and everything in our life. We could call that raising our state of consciousness. I know that sounds airy-fairy and it turns some people off, but I'm just defining how I would use that term. There's a lovely book from the early 1920s, I believe, written by Francis Scoville Shin, and it's called The Game of Life and How to Play It. You can find it for a few dollars on Amazon for a paperback, and I believe there's also a free recording on YouTube. For me, this book felt like a soul companion through some difficult chapters in my life because she really focuses on reframing thoughts to allow this greater connection to divine assistance. One thing she says in the book is that you and God are a majority, right? So if you think you're up against some tough stakes, some really challenging circumstances, well, you're not in that alone. You're in that to the degree you choose to connect to God. If responsibility is seeing our ability to respond and changing ourselves, changing our own circumstances and our own state of consciousness to bring about the healing that we desire, then what is blame? Blame is the opposite of that. Blame is when we have the perception that other people ruined our lives and our life can't get better, or there's a cap to our healing because other people haven't changed enough. So we trap ourselves in a world of people who aren't willing to change, and therefore we disempower ourselves. Some people really cling to this idea that other people ruined their life and they're not willing to move beyond that paradigm. It's so dear to them. And I think that one of the fears that comes up is if I stop blaming other people, then that means the blame moves to myself. So for example, they might be afraid that, oh, well, if I stop blaming other people for permanently ruining my life, then it means it's all my fault. All the pain that I'm experiencing is my fault. And that's their biggest resistance to taking a perspective of responsibility. This can be very aggressive and quite defensive on people's parts, very immediate. And I experienced this when I was on a podcast called Cults to Consciousness. And it is a wonderful podcast that shares the stories of cult survivors and people who escape high control religions. So I was sharing my whistleblowing story, and I told the interviewer that I did not believe on a spiritual level that victims existed, right? That was the level of empowerment that I was choosing to see my abuse through. That on some level, I chose to experience what I went through so that I could learn from it and use it in a positive way. And I have never seen a more vicious internet mob, and that's saying a lot. Partly it was because it was on a very large platform, so I had a lot of eyes on that. But the vitriol with which people came after me, and they were like, how dare you say that? Absolutely, we're victims to what happened to us. Well, I already described and explained this dynamic to you all. Like, spiritual truth is a paradox on one level. There is victim and abuser on another level. There's not. But when we're really clinging to the lower consciousness perspective, to that 3D perspective, rather than being willing to see things from a bigger picture level, why is that? Well, I think it's because people are really afraid that it means, oh, if I'm not a victim here, then it means it's all my fault. And that's such a painful thing to integrate into my psyche. But that's not at all what I am suggesting people do. In fact, moving the blame for your pain from another person to yourself is staying at the same level of consciousness. You're just blame shifting. You're just taking this blame ball and passing it around from person to person. We're not getting above that level of consciousness with that game. So what I'm offering is a way of thinking that actually empowers you beyond that. I'm like picturing this sticky black tarry blame ball that you're like, well, they have to carry, or I have to carry it. Somebody has to carry it. But you can get to a level of wisdom where that nobody has to carry it. Like, you don't have to carry that around in your psyche anymore. When you take responsibility for your circumstances, for the pain you experienced, it sounds like this. Other people made choices that may have really negatively impacted me. And I made choices that may have also really negatively impacted me. But all of that is okay because it is the reality that happened. So I'm choosing to accept it as reality and say, okay, that happened. I'm not enjoying the results I've received from these choices, including my own negative attitude. I don't like the way I'm responding to what happened to me. So I'm going to make different choices now. I am going to respond to reality in a different way. Okay? That's the shift we're making. If you've been in a narcissistic relationship and you struggle with some chronic health problems, there might be a correlation between those two things. This was something that I realized on my own healing journey of healing an autoimmune disease and in my private practice, where I specialize in addressing the root emotional causes of chronic illness. Now, what I'm not saying is that emotional factors are the only contributing factor to developing chronic illness, or that by addressing only the emotional component, you can fully heal a chronic situation. What I am saying is that emotional factors are always, in my observation and experience, a major contributing factor to chronic illness, whether that's autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, Lyme disease, whatever it may be. And these emotional root causes need to be addressed if somebody wants to experience freedom from chronic health problems. Chronic illness liberation is my 25-day process to identify and release the emotional roadblocks in chronic illness. So after this process, you will have recognized some of the major emotional root causes behind your chronic health struggles and started to shift those in your subconscious and with your intuition. This 25-day process takes just 15 minutes a day, and it's fully complementary with any other protocol you're on, any other modality you're using, healthcare approach, diet, because it works on a subconscious and intuitive level. If you're looking for freedom from chronic health issues, this is going to be an invaluable resource for your journey. Go to chronicillnessliberation.com to get started with the 25-day process. The fourth step I took in healing from abuse was being willing to let go of my current sources of support and safety and comfort, and replacing that with divine safety and support and comfort. So where I had once gotten financial stability or a sense of validation or a sense of companionship from an individual, for example, or a system, I chose to cut ties with that and reframe it as, well, now I am inviting God to fill those holes with me. I kind of saw it as I was intentionally creating a vacuum in my life into which God and love could flow. The reason this perspective is so important is because when we're in a narcissistic relationship, whether that's romantic, familial, in a workplace environment, there's always some belief that we need what the narcissist is providing. And the narcissist will, you bet your bottom dollar, they will encourage or even seed that story. So, if we're looking at a romantic relationship, the narcissist might say, oh, this is soulmate love and you won't find it anywhere else. And this is the best sex you'll ever have. You won't get that anywhere else. And if you leave me, nobody else will ever love you like this or ever understand you like this. And they get that into a person's mind real well. You can, listen to a dozen stories of narcissistic abuse survivors, and that's a pretty common thread. So the individual being abused in that situation comes to believe, well, I need the narcissist in my life to get these things. If we look at it from a family relationship, there's this thought of like, oh, well, if I leave my family, how am I going to have the practical support that I need in my life? Maybe there's financial support involved. Maybe there's a sense of community support involved. Maybe if you like me, I left the nutrition school that I whistle blew, and there was a thought of like, oh, so I'm leaving behind my nutrition credentials. I'm leaving behind my community of colleagues. Those were things that I thought I needed for my career and my financial stability in the future. Very often, leaving a narcissistic relationship means leaving behind the things we considered practical and essential to our well-being. There are situations where in a narcissistic relationship, in order to leave, that might cost you your retirement. It might cost you your house. It might cost you all of your belongings. It will probably cost you your reputation in a certain community. In my case, leaving my dad's narcissistic abuse cost me my immediate family, connection with them. And those can seem like such staggering losses. And this is where the reframe is so important, that what is needed for you to grow and expand into your highest self can always be provided by God. I do not know how you're going to get through this without that perspective. So I do understand that this advice is probably only going to land with people who have a spiritual framework or a spiritual value system in some way, some, tangible experience in their life of divine support, because that's what it takes to get out. Like, I'm not going to tell you that everybody who gets out of a narcissistic marriage is going to get out with their physical safety or their financial safety guaranteed. No, often that's not the case. The only guarantee you get is expanding your level of consciousness to connect and allow in divine support. This is where people can get really tripped up because they think, well, those losses are too great for me. I can't afford to lose that because there's no other way that those practical and necessary resources can come back into my life. Well, that's BS, because we live in a world of infinite possibilities, and the power of love, the power of God can do anything. Anything. So you're going to say that the only way for you to have those resources in your life is through connection to a narcissist? I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it from you, and I didn't buy it from myself, because you can bet I tried to sell myself that same excuse. And my soul was just like, oh no, Lauren, no way, you are not selling me that lie. We know the power of love. We know the power of God. It's just that I was so afraid to actually live that. You know, it's one thing to believe something, to say, to state that this is what you believe, but it's another thing entirely to actually live that out. To, like, the way I see it is literally putting one foot forward off the cliff, trusting that you're going to be walking forward on air. And that's how it has felt at many times in my life. But the only way to believe that you can do that, because all things are possible to those who believe, is to actually do it. At this point, I will introduce my definition and theological framework around God and divine support, because I'm using those terms. Now, many of you know that my last book, it came out a couple months ago, is called Jesus Rewritten: How Christianity Changed His Life, Death, and Message. And it explores the hidden history and the theological plot holes behind the Christian religion, and how Christianity today is completely different. Not just altered, but completely and entirely different than what Jesus historically taught and what his earliest followers believe. And I argue that the biblical concept of God, specifically the Old Testament biblical concept of God, and the idea that God could have a new and old covenant and at one point change its mind through this human virgin sacrifice trope, that this is completely an inaccurate understanding of God that leads to an inaccurate understanding of love. When a person has an inaccurate understanding, an illogical understanding, an inconsistent understanding of God and of love, it's going to make this leap of faith that's necessary more difficult, if not impossible. That's why I'm going into this topic briefly here. If you are holding the concept of the biblical God, of this Judeo-Christian God, that is a God made in the image of human ego. And holding that image, holding that concept, can really sabotage a person's journey into deeper faith. And this is why so many people get to a point in their religion where they start to ask some really big questions about theology and the nature of God and what they believe and why they believe it. And the brave ones start to ask those questions. The ones who are just too afraid to leave their sense of certainty and their beliefs will shut down their intuition and their rational mind. And that's how you get fundamentalists. To be able to trust divine love, to be able to trust God practically, not just in words. I mean, there's a lot of people who will just say, oh, they trust God for this and that and blah, blah, this and the other, but they're not actually living it. If you actually want to live it, and you're going to have to live it to fully heal from a narcissistic relationship, then it does require getting to a rational and consistent understanding of what God is. And I go into that in my book, Jesus Rewritten. God is much more a what than a who, much more a verb than a noun. God is not a being who has a heart to break or a mind to change, who commands blood sacrifices, who commands genocide or infanticide, who has a favored people, who requires an innocent person to die for the sins of guilty people, who cannot forgive humanity without a blood sacrifice, God is not even capable of forgiveness in the first place because love is the highest state of consciousness that cannot hold a state of unforgiveness in the first place. These are just a few points, theological points that I go into in my book that is so important to unravel. If you actually want to develop a faith where you can put the pedal to the metal, metaphorically, to rely on divine support where you once relied on the connection or the practical resources obtained from a narcissist or a psychopath. To wrap up this point, one of the most important aspects of my healing from narcissistic abuse was every time I came up against this story that I needed some connection to a narcissist to have what I needed or to be okay or to grow, I said, no, that's a lie. And I challenged myself to fulfill those needs or even grow beyond those needs or recognize that maybe that need was coming from ego so that I could rely more on my connection to love rather than this story that I needed a narcissist in some way. So look at every place in your life that you think you need a narcissist. Do you have the guts to tell yourself, it is a lie that I need them? There is some way forward where I don't need what they're providing for me, where I can cut my losses, even if those losses seem like it would ruin my life and there's no way forward. Are you willing to entertain the possibility and then make it a reality that there is a way forward? You just don't know it yet. But when you develop the courage and the fortitude and the connection to divine support, you will see the way forward. The fifth and final step I'll discuss today on my journey of healing from narcissistic abuse was going no contact with the manipulative individuals in question. Now, I'm going to take you back to this relationship I was in when I was 21 years old with the psychopathic healthcare practitioner. I tried to get out of that relationship maybe like 2 years in. This is very common in abusive relationships where the individual tries to leave, but then they go back. Sometimes it will take 5 iterations, 6, 7, 8. And the reality is you go back as long as it takes for you to wake up. And I, thankfully, woke up after one iteration of trying to pull away and then going back to him. This would be a whole nother podcast for why people do that. But if you've been in this situation, you already know. The manipulation goes so deep. Your sense of self and self-esteem has been worn so thin. It's in many cases shattered entirely. And then on top of that, the abuser has isolated you from friends and family and other support. So there are all these factors that go into why victims keep going back to their abuser. But my first step is if you are in that pattern where you're trying to leave, going back, you haven't left for the first time, you don't know how you're going to, is to do what I did, which was to pray from my soul that I wanted the whole truth out. I didn't even know essentially where that prayer came from. And this is in my book. I actually share the letter that I wrote down as a prayer. And it gives me chills every time I read it because it came from the deepest depths of myself of like, I want the truth here. And I didn't know the truth that I was praying for. I had no clue that I was about to uncover a decade-long systemic sexual abuse cover-up at my nutrition school that led all the way to the founder. No clue. But I prayed for the truth out, and it came at me like a wrecking ball. But that's what I needed. You can bet nothing was going to get me to go back to that man after I learned what I learned, right? So once we see enough truth, we don't go back. It's like people in the medical industry, right? The pharmaceutical industry. A lot of people have negative experiences with the psychopathic abuse, psychopathic marketing, manipulation, and lies with Big Pharma. But then they've been so programmed with this belief, but I need medication. It's sometimes necessary. I can't move forward with this health condition without, the medical industry in some way. And they keep going back until they get enough truth to realize they actually don't need the pharmaceutical industry at all. There are always alternatives. But for some people, it has to get, for most people, I think this is how it works. It gets bad enough, and you get willing enough to see the truth. First of all, to start this no contact step, you've got to see the depths of the darkness. And for me, when it came to my father, it took me 30 years. I was 30 years old before it hit me. Oh my gosh, I see now the depth of manipulation. I see the cruelty that my father has chosen with which to treat his wife and children. And that's a painful, painful thing to see. No wonder we have a lot of resistance to, seeing the full truth in a narcissistic dynamic. It's the lack of seeing the full truth that often creates this pull to go back. A pivotal step in healing from narcissism is just recognizing that the narcissist is consciously inflicting pain on you. They know what they're doing. They're going to keep doing it. They're not going to change, no matter how much you try to, no matter if you go to therapy, no matter how well they talk the talk. It is what it is. And that's really a painful place to be when you've invested a lot of time or a lot of love in that relationship. But that's the essential step that comes before going no contact. Because if you don't fully recognize and integrate this reality that they are consciously hurting you, they don't care enough to change, and they're not going to change, then there's going to keep being this magnetic pull back into the relationship, back into contact, and the no contact isn't going to stick. So once you get to that step of clarity, then comes the step of no contact. Now, one roadblock that I see here is when there are children present and there's co-parenting involved. Some people may choose not to divorce until the children are raised if they're partnered with a narcissist. Some people choose to divorce, then co-parent with the narcissist. And in that situation, either of those, there is a degree of communication involved with the narcissist. I'm more inclined to be favorable towards the path of divorce and co-parenting with as much separation and as limited contact as possible, and possibly even contact only through a lawyer. Because I grew up in a situation with a woman who stayed with her abusive husband. And so it did create an environment where that kind of abuse was normalized for me. But of course, separation is no guarantee that the children will be raised in an environment absence of narcissistic or abusive dynamics, because if a person divorces a narcissist or abuser and doesn't heal the patterns within themselves, they are going to find themselves partnered with typically another abusive or narcissistic individual, and so that pattern can be repeated with a different person. Okay, so it just takes a lot of self-awareness when it comes to these decisions. But until no contact is an option, that is, until the children are grown up and no co-parenting is needed, then what I do recommend is as minimal communication as possible. This is also a really useful step to get to full no contact. And this is what I did when I was choosing to go no contact with my parents. For about 6 months, I really, really scaled back my interaction with them and asked for a few months, or rather stated that for a few months, I was just going to keep to myself, process some things alone, and that I wasn't going to be in contact with them. And in those few months, I got the clarity that I needed. In fact, my health got better, my emotions got better, everything got so much better for me in that time period where I had no contact with them, that it made it very clear the next step that I had to take. Now, a lawyer can also be sometimes helpful or necessary to go no contact with an individual if there still has to be some practical communication. And what a lawyer does in that situation is essentially remove the emotionality of communication between the two parties and just moves it to a very practical level. And potentially that can be done without a lawyer. So that's something to consider. Are you able to communicate in such a way that it's just down to base practicalities, as long as that period is required for communication, and take out any emotional reactions? Don't respond to any attempts the narcissist may make to emotionally rile you up. If you're in that interim period of extricating yourself from a relationship on the trajectory of going no contact. So what that looked like in my case, I'll just give you a really brief overview. Like I said, when I was 30, it really landed with me that my father was a narcissistic individual. And part of that realization came from the fact that I had been away from my family dynamic long enough. And then essentially I moved back to my hometown and into the belly of the beast and had a lot of frequent contact with my parents. After going through this season of my own individual growth and development, becoming a new person myself, and having equipped myself with a new standard of healthy interaction, recognizing manipulative dynamics, coming to the table with healthy communication that I hadn't had before, I was really bringing my new self into this old dynamic, and that allowed me to see it in a new light and see how my parents responded to me bringing healthier tools and a healthier self to the table. If you do that and you're dealing with a narcissist, the result is usually it infuriates them, and you're going to get more pushback than you ever gotten before. Sometimes that can be physical intimidation, verbal bullying taken to the next level. And I saw that myself when I went back, so to speak, into the belly of the beast. When I was 30 years old, I purchased a tiny house on wheels and arranged to put it on my parents' land. They had extra acreage, and that was where I was going to park my tiny house. So, I really was going back into the family dynamic, because here I was needing a big resource that they were providing. I was needing a very practical, or accepting a very practical, tangible resource that they were providing in terms of a place to put my home. That did increase my interaction with them. I was hanging out with them a lot more, being so close in physicality to them, being back in my hometown. And that was a gift that had to happen in my life. I had to go back into the belly of the beast as a new person to see the old dynamic with fresh eyes and realize that it was not going to work at all. And so the first step I took was I realized I needed to move my house off of that land. I found somewhere else to park it, because that's an essential early step. You have to disinvest wherever the narcissist is providing you something. Because I had been through a similar process with my psychopathic healthcare practitioner, we had a business together. I kind of went through some difficult practical learning experiences of how to separate physical resources before you tell the narcissist that you're going no contact. Get as resourced as you can before you drop that no contact bomb. Just for practicality's sake, don't let them know it's coming. For example, the week that I uncovered this super dark history of the healthcare practitioner that I was with, that same week, we had a business together, a supplement company together. And that's a whole side story in the book, but this is common for predators. He was basically financially siphoning me through this business. And I knew that I couldn't tell him my next steps until I went to our shared bank account. It was in both our names, and I withdrew half of the money so he couldn't get it. And I knew as soon as he got a whiff of what I had done, things were going to hit the fan. He knew what I was going to do next, and sure enough, he did. But that was a really practical step that I had to take first. So I got everything lined up. I knew my next steps. And that was one of the most important practical steps that I took. And I truly believe that if I hadn't done that, he would have pulled all the money out of our business bank account and tried to blackmail me with that or coerce me with that. And goodness knows how much more intensive it would have gotten for me in terms of lawyers and legal fees to try to recoup that. So if there is a practical resource that you are currently relying on from the narcissist, get your ducks in a row, take what is legally yours, cover your behind. And so in my case, it meant moving my tiny house off my parents' land. I gave them just a couple days of notice that I was doing it. I had my next place all lined up. And when I told them that I was moving, had everything lined up, because, I didn't know how they were going to respond to that. That's also when I said that I was going to be taking some time without contact with them. I didn't say that I had made a full no contact decision. I actually hadn't at that point, but I knew it was so unhealthy for me to have contact with them. I was getting very sick, physically sick. Everything I was seeing with my fresh eyes was just like sending me back into PTSD in some ways. So I moved to a property where they didn't know where I was physically. I cut off contact with them temporarily. And for the period of time where I cut off that contact, I didn't know my next steps. I didn't know that I was going to go full no contact with my parents. It was a major defining decision, both very challenging and very empowering in my life. But it took me some time to get there. And in that period of time where I was out of my parents' yard, essentially, their extra acreage, and I wasn't having any contact with them, I got healthier, I got grounded, I got clearer. It's very hard to get to full clarity when you do have frequent or really any contact with the narcissist. If you're sharing your thought processes or your decision-making process with a narcissist, you're going to get real tangled up real fast. And so even if you can't wrap your head around full no contact, take a period of reducing contact as much as possible so that you can get that clarity, so you can hear your own thoughts. Because if you share any part of your questioning or decision-making process with that narcissist, you're going to get confused very, very quickly. And it was during that time where I said I was just taking a step back for a while and I was going to be in my own space. I wasn't going to talk to them for a while. That's what I communicated to them. It was in that period of time I got very clear that I needed to go full no contact and that it would require me to take some very big and very brave next steps in my life to do that, to permanently say goodbye to my immediate family. And one of the things that happened, I received a series of very clarifying dreams. In one dream, I was shown the fallout that would happen if I tried to get the last word, if I tried to get what my ego wanted out of the situation. It would have been a mess, and I saw the cost to myself. I had dreams after I went full no contact with my parents of how they were responding. I saw my dad doing his smear campaign against me to our neighbors and relatives. And it was quite painful, but of course that is what happens. And your reputation is the cost for your freedom. Your reputation is how other people perceive and judge you through their level of consciousness, and it's not who you are. So you have to be willing to let go of that. And in another dream after I went full no contact, my mother came to me in that dream, screaming at me, saying, "You should be grateful after all we've done for you." It was pure vitriol from a woman who was in such complete denial that she was married to an abuser. She was in such complete denial of the abuse she had experienced herself and had been complicit in allowing her children to experience. And that was her response. So it was pretty uncanny, but talk about clarity. And I share this not because I think this is necessarily everyone's outcome. Like, some people are going to get clarity in other ways. But for me, when I was willing to make the decision that I didn't want to make, that seemed most challenging and would require the most courage on my part. When I was willing to do that, I got the clarity I needed. And so I would leave that for you to consider on your path. If you open yourself up, being willing to do the thing you think is impossible, it is very likely, if not certain, that then you will be provided the clarity on your next steps. When I hear people complain that they're not getting the clarity they need of what step to take in their life or what direction to go, what it comes down to is those individuals are deep down not willing to do the harder thing. There's a willingness that has to happen at a heart and a soul level that goes so deep, and it can take a lot of prayer and surrender to get there. So if you're lacking the clarity right now, that would be my suggestion, is work on the willingness first. Here's another good tip on your path to going no contact. When you're in that period of pulling back, getting your ducks in a row, maybe getting the clarity that you need, it's very likely the narcissists have like this psychic sense of when you're pulling back and getting clarity, and they will up the ante with their manipulation. This is actually a blessing in disguise, because if you're wavering on, oh, maybe they don't actually mean to hurt me, maybe they're not doing this on purpose, maybe they just really are traumatized and they can't help themselves. Because if you're having those thoughts and the narcissist up the ante on the manipulation, it's such a gift because it like flies in your face. Basically, it feels like a gut punch or a kick in the head. That's certainly what it felt like for me. But it was a gift because I could see it more clearly. The volume was turned up. Here's an example of that. It was probably a week before I told my parents I had lined up a move and I was moving my tiny house off of their land and was going to take a step back from contact with them. I got an email from my dad, and it was this letter dripping in manipulative rhetoric. I mean, you can check it off the boxes, the manipulation tactics that narcissists use. It was there, and it really did feel like a gut punch to me. It was so clear to me how much he just wanted to get what's called supply, like ego validation, out of any interaction with me, and that's all that he cared about. I was sitting with like, oh my gosh, like what do I do with this letter? It was pure manipulation. And I realized the only response that I had, like I was not going to be clear with what my next steps were. I was not going to open the door to any way that he was going to get back into my mind, start the mind games. Like, I knew that at this point. I had been through the process. Like I said, if you are unclear in your next steps and you start talking to a narcissist about what to do about it, they will get you very confused. That's why I do not recommend therapy with a narcissist. Absolutely not. Dangerous, in fact. I worked with 2 mentors in this process by myself. So essentially, I was doing a version of therapy for myself. But there was no way in hell I was going to get my father involved in that, because I already knew who he was, and that he had done this with my mom. They had gone to couples therapy, and he, like narcissists can wrap a therapist around their finger and confuse my mom further. So I had a track record to fall back on. All that to say, I got off track a little bit, but the response that I gave to my father's letter was just, okay. That's all I wrote back. And that is one of the most useful responses you can give to a narcissist before you're at a place to go full no contact, because you're not fighting with them. So you're denying the supply of validation and emotional intensity that they're counting on. You aren't getting entangled in trying to prove yourself, which just depletes your energy that you need to take care of yourself and move yourself forward. You're not showing them an emotional reaction, which is what they're trying to get out of you. So just taking any kind of emotionality out of the communication and just being as absolutely clear and practical and minimal as you can be, not involving the narcissist in your decision-making process, and getting the clarity you need with taking as much space from the narcissist as you possibly can to get that clarity. Those are all my practical steps to get to this place of full no contact. A big roadblock I want to address when it comes to going no contact, especially with a family member. I see this as most prevalent with a family member, less prevalent with a workplace relationship or a romantic relationship, but there can be a degree of guilt and a sense of obligation to stay in contact or keep supporting the narcissistic individual. And here, I just want to introduce the concept, the difference between obligation and honor. Guilt is an emotion, and it's produced by these thoughts of obligation. Obligation usually comes from a need of validating ourselves and other people's perceptions of like, oh, I'm going to be a bad sister, daughter, wife, mother if I step away, right? Well, where does that framework come from? Who's going to see you as bad? Where is the guilt coming from? Guilt is a fear-based emotion. So really, obligation is being a slave to your own fear-based level of consciousness or another person's fear-based level of consciousness. Honor is very different. Honor comes from a consciousness of love. For me, the inner dialogue of honor sounds like, I am willing to do God's will here, whether I want to or not, whether it's going to be the hardest thing I've ever done, whether it may appear impossible to me. Thy will be done, God. Thy will be done, love. I am willing to lose validation, reputation, and my identity, even the things that I consider my security, my ultimate security. I'm willing to lose those things on this path of love and trust that love will be enough for me. And for me, honor is making myself available to be an instrument of God's love, no matter how uncomfortable that is for me, no matter how dangerous it is for me, and no matter how much that choice is going to be misunderstood by other people. So I did have a lot of clarity between obligation and honor in going no contact with my immediate family. I certainly felt some guilt, but it helped that I had such clarity of what the path of honor was for me. If you're thinking, well, Lauren, how do I get the clarity of a decision in my life that would be motivated from obligation or motivated from honor? How do I know the difference? I've got 3 resources for you. The first one is listen to the previous episode of this podcast. It's called How to Become Manipulation Proof, and it gives practical, discernible differences between love and fear in your decision-making process, so you can start to identify when your motivations are coming from love or from fear. It's a 30-day intuitive writing process that guides you to identify the motivation for your decisions, how your decisions may have been programmed by external influences, and how to get to decisions that really reflect the well-being of your own soul, and doing that by getting in touch with your intuition in a very practical way. And the last and final resource here is to read my book, The Scorpion and the Lion, which I have already discussed in this podcast, and that will give you some practical guidance as well. I'll leave you with one last tidbit on this note of going no contact with a narcissist. If guilt is cropping up, if confusion is cropping up about your best next steps and what does a loving decision really look like, I encourage you to entertain the concept that you are not estranging yourself from that relationship. Rather, the narcissist estranged you. So I think it's very likely my parents consider that I have estranged them. That's probably the story that they're telling, that I chose to leave the family, betray the family, whatever that story is for them. However, I started to turn that around and think, wait a minute, did I really estrange myself from my parents, particularly my father? Or is it possible that because he bullied me for 30 years, he emotionally abused me, he treated me with great emotional cruelty for 30 years, isn't he the one who estranged me? Like, isn't that actually on him? You see the turnaround here? This is really helpful if you're getting mired in the guilt, which is essentially one of the hooks that the narcissist used to keep you giving them supply, okay? But like, think of it this way. If somebody treats you poorly, as a narcissist does, if somebody lies to you, emotionally abuses you, bullies you, they obviously don't want you to stay in their life. Like, I had to reframe it this way. If I bullied somebody, lied to somebody, emotionally abused someone, was cruel to them in the pursuit of my own selfish desires, why would I expect them to stay in my life? I wouldn't. I would expect that all of my actions would push that person away. I was making it very clear to them, if I did that I don't want you in my life. So it finally dawned on me that that's what my father has been saying to me with his actions his whole life. I don't want you in my life. Doesn't this make sense? This is what any narcissist is actually saying with their actions if you look at their actions and stop falling for their words, which is, the big growth point here, because the narcissist is so good at using words to manipulate. But same with a romantic relationship. If somebody cheats on you, lies to you, treats you with scorn, they obviously don't want to be in contact with you. That's not how a person behaves if they want a long-term relationship. So I kind of just realized, oh, wait a minute. I am honoring my father's wishes by going no contact here. Obviously, he's treated me this way because he doesn't want me in his life. This is not the way you treat a person if you want them to choose to stay in your life. So I am honoring my father by leaving. Another perspective here is that this is love to allow a person to experience the consequences of their actions. A natural consequence to narcissistic behavior is that people aren't going to like you and aren't going to want to stay in your life and aren't going to want to provide you with any kind of practical support. Duh. That's a natural consequence to narcissistic actions. So love the narcissist enough to allow them to experience that consequence. Because how else are they supposed to learn? They're probably not going to learn in this lifetime. Probably not. But a seed can be planted. And you know what? A seed can also be planted for those watching. What if there was a narcissist to be, someone who was at the crossroads, and they start to observe, oh, if I treat people like that, they leave, they withdraw support, they tell the truth about how I treated them, and they go no contact. See, this is a very loving thing to do for everyone involved. Yourself, the narcissist, and people you've never met, right? Love allows a person to experience the consequences of their actions. And love allows you to create a life of freedom from manipulation. We covered a lot in this episode. Thanks for staying with me. I really wanted to equip you with some practical steps here, as well as examples from my own life, so you can have encouragement and motivation that doing the challenging thing to experience freedom from narcissistic abuse in your life is worth it, and it is possible. If you enjoyed this episode of the Truth Activist Podcast, please drop a like or a comment if you're listening on YouTube, or a review if you're listening on any other podcast platform. I really appreciate the support. Stay tuned for the next episode. Bye-bye.